Hello there, I'm Haslinda Amin. Thank you for joining us on Greening Trade. This session will be done in two parts. The first 30 minutes will be a moderated panel discussion. The next 30 minutes will be a detailed exchange that's limited only to forum members and partners. In the course of this virtual WEF week, we heard from global leaders sounding the alarm on climate threats, calling for response, reiterating that green growth is absolutely possible. And to that end, trade can play a big part in saving the planet if it is done better, if it makes a shift to no or low carbon. Right now, international trade accounts for about 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, but the links between trade and climate have often been underexplored, and that's mostly because policymakers tend to look at both trade and climate in isolation. And add to that, trade and the environment communities may not necessarily see eye to eye. Still, the 2030 Agenda calls on all countries to use trade to create a more sustainable, a more inclusive, a more resilient world. So how do we get there? What trade approaches and actions are needed? What role can business play in the pursuit of net zero carbon emissions? Well, today we're really privileged to have with us Frank Riester, France's Minister Delegate for Foreign Trade and Economic Attractiveness, Jeroen Ahon, Global Senior Partner and Clifford Chance, Anna Kritikov, Head of Sustainable Development at Glencore International. Anna, gentlemen, thank you for being here. Minister, bonjour, and that's the extent of my French. Let's start with you. I mean, is there a conflict between trade and environment protection and climate action? Can they be complementary? Essentially, are they friends, foes, or are they frenemies?
Hello everybody. First perhaps I should say that it's quite unrealistic to consider that we should do without trade. Natural resources are not shared equally, and I think that no country can be entirely autonomous. And so trade has brought many things to many people and has brought many people out of poverty. And international value chains lead to efficient specialization according to competitive edges. And so trade also allows supply chains to deliver indispensable goods across the globe. And so we will therefore maintain our economy in open economy. And we want the EU to remain open. And so for that, we need to have a consistency between our sustainable development agenda and our trade practices. We have to have a consistency between efforts we ask people and ask company and the kind of trade we are supporting. And so it's very important to consider that in a political standpoint, these efforts we ask to people are not diminished by the increase of imports from areas that not apply the same ambitions or the same standards. And so we have globally to create more ambition and more standards so that we could globally increase results of our policy instead of creating the condition for a race to the bottom, in fact. And so perhaps I would like to give you two examples of what we are going to do, or we are doing. First is the carbon border adjustment mechanism to fight against the carbon leakage in a WTO in a WTO compatible way. It's for us very important to be compatible to the WTO. And the second example is how we deal with deforestation imported. It's unbelievable that we could imagine that increasing trade, increasing trade to be creating that increasing trade could create more imported deforestation, and so that we have to create instruments within the EU regulation to legislation to fight against deforestation imported. And that's the problem we have in the trade agreement with Mercosur. And so we are trying to find solution to be sure that the increase of our trade with Mercosur wouldn't increase the imported deforestation. And we believe that it's important to create this regulation, to put pressure as well to the private sector to be more fair in this kind of topic as well.
Putting pressure on the private sector, Minister, I want to bring Jeroen into this conversation then. Jeroen, how do you think trade policymakers can better align incentives with sustainable zero-emission supply chains? How would this help companies enact ESG commitments?
Thank you very much, Haslinda, and thank you very much, first of all, for having me on this panel. And also, good morning, everyone, or good day, everyone, on this last day of the Davos week. So thank you for joining on this last Friday. I agree, Haslinda, you know, the move to net zero must be supported by trade policies. And you said in your introduction, you spoke about friends or foes. And there is this sort of myth that trade and climate are somehow unnatural bedfellows, that they are mutually exclusive and that they do work in two different worlds, you know, the WTO world and the Paris Agreement world. And that doesn't have to be the case. Trade and climate can go hand in hand and should go hand in hand, and trade can be a driver of environmental and sustainable productivity and efficiency. And there isn't much that governments can do to help move the needle on this. So let me mention 4 points. First of all, there is the elimination of tariffs on environmentally beneficial goods and to remove barriers on environmentally friendly services. And that's a clear opportunity and can be done in a way that is entirely consistent with the broader trade liberalizing objectives of the WTO. Now, many will be aware of the negotiations for an environmental goods agreement between 2014 and 2016. Those regrettably came to an end, did not succeed. We can get into that later, but there are some moves to reinvigorate those discussions, and that's good. Secondly, there is clearly more that can be done to remove tariff barriers to trade in environmental goods. So technical, environmental, and other standards can be important and can be part of any regulatory systems, but those policies should not unnecessarily increase the costs of adopting technologies which help businesses to reduce the carbon intensity of their production processes. And thirdly, and this is a big one, and we heard President Biden speak about it 2 days ago, it is the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. These obviously slow down efforts to decarbonize businesses. And again, we can get into more detail later if you'd like. But it was very encouraging to see President Biden speak about that the day before yesterday and in his executive orders. And finally, and Minister Riester already mentioned it a moment ago, there is the big theme of carbon border adjustments. Those impose additional taxes on carbon-intense imports. And if introduced, they are likely to have a really significant impact on supply chains. Now, carbon border adjustments, and I heard the minister say it has to be done within the WTO framework. And that's a big debate again, because they are scary on the one hand. They can be very complicated, they can be fraud prone, and they risk country protectionism. On the other hand, they excite, because if done right, they will help adjust hard-to-abate industries. So I think those are 4 areas in which governments can help, and it really is the way to bring the world of WTO and Paris together. So let me stop there, Linda. Thank you.
We'll pick up on fossil fuel subsidies as well as carbon tax slightly later. But first, Anna, I want to come to you and talk about the circular economy. It is an important way to tackle emissions for many sectors, and it's been estimated that eliminating waste through circular economy could bring benefits worth $4.5 trillion. But I mean, as production and consumption is global, what are the supply chain considerations for recycling materials here?
Thank you, Haslinda, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. When we talk about the global nature of production and consumption, exactly as you say, I think it's also important to think about carbon footprints also in that holistic way. And I suppose from a Glencore perspective, we're a little bit, we look at it from two lenses. We look at it as a mining company with a footprint, and we look at it as a company with a significant presence in recycling. So looking at the end use of these metals and giving them a second life. But let me take a step back and start at the start. And think about this holistic perspective that we must talk about, and that trade is fundamental to. I think any transition strategy must take into account the full spectrum of operational portfolio and commodity impacts. And you alluded to that when you talked about the role that trade plays in the global carbon footprint. I suppose from our perspective, we looked at our startup when we started thinking about our transition and our transition strategy. We thought about our industrial footprint, but we quickly realized that really it's only 10% of our total footprint when we consider the emissions from the use of our products. So in our case, our commitment to net zero covers our full footprint, and we are the first mining company to do so. And we believe that that's critical to meaningfully participating in the global transition to carbon neutrality and participating in this whole of business, whole of world, whole of industry thinking. And I think, you know, when we think specifically about circularity, we of course start by talking about contraction of some of the high emitting sectors. We've alluded to fossil fuels already. But of course, we also say, okay, so recycling is key here. And as you alluded to that as well. I think what we see in recycling today, and this is where I think there's such an important role for greater coherence between policy and action, is that we absolutely see today a growing interest in consumer interest in sustainability credentials and responsible sourcing and recycling content. And that's great. And that then, of course, drives greater programming by metal using companies to take back products to collect the waste. But this is where we come up against a barrier. And the barrier is that as we are looking to responsibly and safely collect and recycle the scrap, we are then contending with a global package of regulations. And of course, some are, it's unfair to generalize, but as of course, some are far more sophisticated than others. But the broad regulation is still anchored in thinking of scrap as a hazard and is taking precautions to address that, whether you're talking about collection, transportation, or treatment. And so in practice, what we see is that for companies that are complying with this regulation, it's incredibly difficult to recycle at scale. I'll give you an example. Some of our the scrap that our customers have collected for us to recycle has been sitting in the country of origin for a year, not because there's any problem with payment or any problem with the customer or any problem, but because the regulation is so complex that dealing through the intricacies of the storage, the shipping, the transportation is incredibly complex and is very much framed within that context. And I think one of the downsides of that, besides, of course, limiting the ability of the sector, the formal sector to grow, is the proliferation of the informal sector. And I think that theme is so important, and it's something that the minister has alluded to as well. The community impacts, the proliferation of informal practices that result in unsafe and poor environmental practices can be addressed through an evolved regulation that will address these questions of how do we think about recycling in this new world? How do we think of it as part of the package? And how do we make sure that vulnerable people are not left behind or further marginalized as we're looking to embrace this, to embrace and enable this transition to carbon neutrality?
I guess in a way, it requires a mindset change too. Minister, I want to bring you back into this conversation. France has always been a strong advocate of strong environmental protections in trade agreements. What do you think ambitious trade partners could do to better support sustainable zero-emission supply chains?
First, we believe that trade agreements are good tools to ensure consistency, coherence between our climate ambition and trade. And so we want to use in the future even more the trade agreements to help us to move on these issues. And for instance, we want in the future that in all future trade agreements, the respect of the Paris Agreement would be an essential clause of the agreement, and we'll have to in which we are working on how to monitor the implementation of the Paris Agreement within the relationship between the different countries with which we are signing some agreements. And second, we think that we can already monitoring the implementation of trade sustainable development chapters, because we have already in the bilateral agreements between EU and other countries some engagement of sustainable development. And so we think that we have to better check the implementation of these chapters. We can see that these chapters are already binding, because the panel that has worked on the EU-Korea agreement has shown that there are some issues that are not correctly taken into account, by Korea, and so we are putting some pressure on Korea for that. But we think that in the future we'll have to put some sanctions in the agreement, in the chapters, so that we could directly put sanctions if the commitments are not achieved. And third, we think that in the multilateral level we have to do better. We have to put sustainable development even more in multilateral agreement in the WTO, and the reform of the WTO will be useful for that. And we think that in the ongoing negotiation we could be better, we could do better. And I could say that the fishery negotiation could be a good example of how we could put more sustainable development in the agreements and in negotiations. And I totally agree with Anna that it's very important to use trade agreements to take the different private actors to a more circular economy, to a more circular processes, and so it will be at the heart of our ministerial conference at the WTO level at the end of the year, specifically perhaps on plastic issues.
Jérôme, as you indicated slightly earlier, sometimes it's also about removing incentives as it is about introducing incentives. And you mentioned fossil fuel subsidies. By some calculation, global carbon emissions will be cut by 20%. And by doing that, government coffers can be added by trillions of dollars. Yet this is not happening fast enough. Why is that so? And what can be done about that?
Well, thank you, Haslinda. I mean, the abolishment of fossil fuel subsidies is obviously politically fraught. There is, of course, a big lobby for keeping them in place. They've been talking about abolishing fossil fuel subsidies, I think, since 2009. But, the stars are now more aligned. We've heard this week a lot about, the net zero ambitions and targets of China, of the EU, and now of the US. And I think if you listened again, as I said in my first opening remarks, to President Biden and to John Kerry, earlier this week also here in Davos about eliminating fossil fuel subsidies in the US, which is particularly, of course, a country where there's been a lot of support for these subsidies. I mean, that is a big move. I think the fossil fuel subsidies stand at something like $500 billion, and they clearly distort, existing trade flows and incentivize continued reliance on these high emission production processes. So I think taking away these fossil fuel subsidies will make a big difference. And we could also think that at a time when government finances are even more strained as governments seek to respond to COVID-19 and there's sort of less fiscal space, the potential to redirect these environmentally harmful subsidies to other initiatives is I think, significant. So I think we'll see real move there, and I think the more certainties that exist for companies about the long-term shape of these policies and of these subsidies disappearing, the more willing businesses will be to make the big shifts that are needed. Thank you.
And Anna, as you suggested earlier, Glencore has been pretty successful in meeting, exceeding its ESG targets. Part of the whole equation is also social inclusion. Take us through the thinking behind that and how it's benefited, I guess, it's provided more equality.
Yeah, and thanks, Haslinda. And I think this question of inclusion is so much at the heart of what we're talking about. And as COVID-19 brings more into focus questions of inequality, of social detriment caused by the pandemic, we need to ensure that as we are working to create and establish a low carbon economy, we're not leaving people behind. As we think about that from an energy perspective, the importance of inclusive energy and the importance of, again, thinking about that from a policy perspective cannot be understated. But also, I think, as supply chains, we started this panel by talking about the global nature of production and consumption, and that just continues to be, I think, a sort of a thread that weaves through this conversation. One example that we've really grappled with and engaged with is the commodity of cobalt, an essential commodity needed for electric vehicles, for batteries. It underpins in a lot of ways. It's essential to the transition to low carbon economy. However, we've seen how absolutely legitimate concerns about terrible operating practices and child labor that's associated with the artisanal mining of that cobalt in parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo has risked marginalizing further already vulnerable people as their concerns would start driving sort of purchasing behaviors for the commodity. So we've been working with the whole, with the cobalt supply chain, with our partners in that chain, with who we work commercially, as well as on the ground. We've looked to address this challenge by becoming a founding member of the Fair Cobalt Alliance, which is a whole of supply chain partnership that recognizes that that artisanally mined cobalt, that cobalt produced by people, very, very poor, very vulnerable people, can absolutely play a legitimate role in the supply chain, but that we must take action to eradicate child labor and improve operating conditions in those cooperatives. And I think it's that the reason I give that example is because I think we must, as supply chains, and obviously we're looking at support from policy as well, to be mindful of how as we're looking towards not only a low carbon economy, but a successful low carbon economy, that we don't inadvertently widen the gap of inequality.
Minister, earlier you talked about the border carbon tax as planned by the EU. How far do you think that will prevent carbon leakage? Do you see the move even encouraging non-EU companies exporting to Europe to cut emission and in turn cut what's charged to them? Or could the move lead to protectionist response by other trading blocs instead?
It's for us, we believe that this kind of mechanism will force other countries to be more ambitious in that field, and that the cost because more important to produce within a green way will be compensated by the mechanism, so that we could put pressure on countries that do not apply this kind of good way of producing, and so the difficulty is that we don't want that it could be a kind of competitiveness tool, but a tool to put everyone in a good way to produce. And that's the difficulty we have in front of us, so that this mechanism could be accepted by everyone, in fact, even by the US, even by China, and even by all the country that are engaged in the climate fight, and we have to convince our partners of the pertinence of this mechanism.
Jérôme, do you agree? Do you think it will encourage the others to follow suit?
I think, as Linda, that would be the hope, and I do agree with the Minister. It's a matter of communication to understanding why it is needed, because without the carbon border adjustments, there is the risk of leakage, both in getting imports from countries where there are less environmental standards, and the other way, businesses moving out of, for example, region to the EU to countries where that is the case. And as I said in my introduction, it's both, on the one hand, these adjustments are on the one hand scary, they can be very complex, lead to a lot of bureaucracy, and also lead to protectionism, which is why there's this concern, and that is why there's a direct conflict with the liberalized trade idea behind the WTO thinking. But at the same time, they can have very positive benefits as well and level the playing field. So I do agree with the Minister, but it will be one that is potentially fraught with conflict. And as we know, currently the WTO is not very operational, certainly not the appellate body. So how do you resolve disputes? Now, I'm a litigation lawyer, so it means a lot of business for people like me, but I don't think it is what will further the cause of sustainability. So I think that whole bringing together of the WTO and Paris thinking, as I said in my introduction, and you mentioned it, friend or foe, and are they strange bedfellows? I think there's a lot of work and thinking that continues to need to go into that. And I heard the Minister say, we want to make these cross-border adjustments WTO compliant. But there's a level of complexity there. But I think it is the right direction at the moment until there is a real level playing field.
That's right. I mean, the reorganization of the WTO could be a step in the right direction. And I know we talked about how there are lots and lots of challenges, but we've got to consider the role of clean technology. Clean energy can play a significant role in the transition to a green economy. It helps resources be used in a more sustainable manner. Waste products can be recycled. The question really is access to these clean technology. What are the key issues here?
Thank you. I suppose it's one of the big ones. Look, I think the first barrier, and really kind of going back to the foundations of this, the principal barrier is access to the commodities required for these technologies. We cannot build solar panels, wind turbines. We cannot look at the transformation of the energy systems that we need. We cannot electrify transportation without access to metal. We've done some modeling of the various climate scenarios that have been developed. And we see under any scenario, whether we continue as we are or we achieve that radical transformation, we see a material uplift in demand for metals such as copper, cobalt, zinc, nickel. And of course, there's only so much metal that exists in the world. I think we've seen under some of the scenarios, demand for copper expecting to double by 2050 and for cobalt to quadruple. where does that metal come from? And of course, recycling will be part of the answer. And we've talked about that. We've talked about the fantastic potential, but also some of the barriers that we see from our perspective today. But I think we also have to think about the fact that we will need to access new metal. Recycling is not going to be able to fulfill all the needs. We will need new metal. And this is going to be made more challenging going forward because the new mines that we know of, the reserves that we know of today that are not being mined are increasingly located in hard to get to, high risk, difficult to operate in places that carry with them very significant social and environmental considerations. And again, and as I've said before, it is so important to make sure that we don't lose sight of those considerations and make sure that we work on them hand in hand. And so I think it's an important, it's a barrier, it's a consideration, and I think there's some thought to be put to how policymakers in some of these mineral-rich countries and how their partners in sophisticated jurisdictions such as the European Union, for example, don't lose sight of how to continue to enable access to that new metal while also not compromising on the importance of responsible operating practices. How do we move those hand in hand?
There is a question here from a participant, and Minister, maybe I'll pose this to you. Do you agree that in the new normal, we must reject trade at all costs and push instead for trade to be built on credible inclusivity, sustainability, integrity, and transparency? And I guess, you know, amid the pandemic, there's always an urge to put yourself first.
The beginning of the panel that, in my opinion, it's unbelievable to think that we should do without trade, because it's useful for many people and it's useful for economy, and many people in development countries are waiting for some services, some products we have in some other countries since a long time. So the issue is how to produce and to exchange, and how to produce in a greener way, recycling, thanks to innovation. So we have to invest a lot in innovation, and we have to be sure that the increase of trade would not have a negative impact in specific ways. I talked sooner about deforestation, and I could say that the trade could be perhaps a way to push some countries to do better in sustainable development. That's really in our mind in France and in Europe. It's to use the lever, the tool of trade agreements, of trade partnership, to push people that need to trade with us to do better in sustainable development, in biodiversity, in deforestation, in climate change fight. So no, I think that we have to be open. We have to be determined to maintain international trade for all the reasons I advocated: jobs, prosperity, access to services and to certain products for many countries. But we have to invest a lot in technologies so that the way we produce could be more sustainable. And we have to use the tool of trade agreements to push everyone to go up in our practices, to produce, to consume. And I think it's possible. The fact that the US come back in the Paris Agreement, and the fact that Biden and Kerry and the new administration is so implicated, involved in sustainable development issues is a good news for all the world. And I think as China is says that they are really committed on these issues as well, I think we could do much better in the years to come.
On that very optimistic note, Minister,
yes,
I'd like to thank you, Jeroen, as well as Anna, for the insights today. We wrap up the first session of this hour-long session. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you.